finishing up our study here in the chapter. I think we'll finish it today. We've only got four verses, so maybe we can finish it. But as we often do, setting back into the context of the larger structure of Romans, chapter 12 is the breaking point where we move from the indicative, as one scholar says. We're talking about Paul's theology. Now we're moving to the imperative. What do we do as a result of what he has shared with the church at Rome and ultimately what he shared with us through the power of the Spirit? And what we need to do in chapter 13, first of all, is to respect the authorities. God has put them in place for good. Secondly, we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. We had a good discussion, I think, last week talking about what does that mean? And what does it mean when people around us will say something like, well, love is love? And we looked at C.S. Lewis's take on that. There really are 4 words for love in Greek. And so we might say there are more than one way to love, but the word that's used in Romans 13, agape, is what C.S. Lewis calls gift love. It's something that the giver gives, putting the needs of others before his own. And of course, God is the great model of gift love in giving us his Son with our sin. And so we're called to live that out. And now finally, there's an awareness at the end of chapter 13 that we're living in what these early Christians would have called the last days. We're still in that time frame. Jesus has not returned, but we anticipate his soon return. And so as we live in the last days, one thing we're anticipating is what the Old Testament prophets called the day of the Lord. Now for them, the day of the Lord typically was a day of judgment. Sometimes it was judgment on the enemies of Israel who had been oppressing God's covenant people. More often the prophets were prophesying a day of the Lord on Israel because they had disobeyed God and broken the covenant they'd made with him. But there was always a day of the Lord for hope as well. And that appears to be what Paul is focusing on here. And so you'll notice some time references. You'll notice some focus on, because of that, we need to be living in certain ways that will advance the cause of the kingdom and the work of God in our life. So let's read these last several verses in chapter 13, beginning in verse 11, and then we'll make some connections to some other texts that will, I think, help us better understand what Paul's saying here. Verse 11 in chapter 13, do this, knowing the time, that it is already the hour for you to awaken from sleep. See, we've got an alarm going off right now. You couldn't have even planned that. For an alarm to go off while I was reading this text that tells us that we need to awaken from sleep. For now, salvation is nearer to us than when we believed. The night is almost gone, and the day is near. Therefore, let us lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. So you can see Paul shifts very quickly to an acknowledgement of the times in which we're living. What, again, the Old Testament prophets would say is the day of the Lord that's coming, or as the early church would say, living in the last days. And here's the thing, the image here is of one who is sleeping and unaware of the time. Let's just be honest, as believers, we should never be unaware of what's going on. Now, Jesus, in his own comments on his return, first of all said, and this is an important truth to always keep in mind when we talk about the return of Christ, no one knows the day or the hour. Only the Father, not even the Son, knows that time when he's coming back. This is a great caution to remind ourselves there are always people making predictions about when Jesus is coming back. And they take a variety of forms, and most recently they've been based on what we might say, signs in the heavens, if you've been following for the last several years. Yeah, and so we're looking at, for example, the blood moons, and these eclipses where the moon turns red, and these are said to be signs of what God is doing, and there are this number of blood moons in this time frame, and some of them coalesce or connect with feast days of Israel. And so these are the times and I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to those things. In fact, Genesis 1 says that God put the sun and the moon and the stars in the heavens for signs and seasons and days and years. There's definitely something there to it. We could go back to Old Testament prophets like Joel, who says in the last days when the day of the Lord comes that the moon will turn to blood. So it's not as if there aren't some connections, but I would just say don't become troubled about it. If someone says, hey, we got 4 blood moons coming up in the next 2 years, and this has got to be the sign of Jesus coming. It certainly could be. Although I'm of the opinion, if anyone says Jesus is coming back on this day, that's a day I know he's not coming back.
Yeah.
No one knows the day or the hour. All right. But the reality is we have a lot of pressure around us in terms of this time idea that Jesus is coming back and that we need to predict that in some way. We can't do it. But what Jesus did say is that this day should not overtake us who are believers in some way that we're unaware. Now, here's the way that works. I don't know when he's coming back, but what if I woke up every morning and lived like today could be the day he's coming back? Then would I be ready for his return?
Yeah.
And at the same time, could I then do the good works that God would have me to do? Those, as Ephesians said, he's prepared beforehand for me to walk in.
Right.
And so I think that the best way to deal with the time question, when is Jesus coming back, is, well, it's exactly what Paul says here. It's sooner now than it was when we first believed. And so we recognize we're moving ever closer to the return of Christ. We need to live like Jesus could come back at any moment. I've told you this before. I had a barber, which, by the way, I can tell today I need a barber. I've got hair hanging down in my eyes. But I had a barber when I was a kid, and I remember overhearing a conversation between him and my dad. And he said, I want to live my life so that when Jesus comes back, he finds me doing something good. He doesn't catch me doing something evil. And I don't know how old it was, maybe 6 or 7 years old. That stuck with me, and I began to think about that. I want to live that way so that at any moment, if Jesus happened to come back, he'd find me doing what's right.
Right.
He wouldn't catch me in a sin that I'd be ashamed of. And so I think that's a good principle when we talk about the idea of the time. But I do want to connect a little bit more with this. Let's read again verse 12. The night is almost gone. You ever woken up in the middle of the night, it's still dark out, and you can't go back to sleep, and you're just sort of laying there, and you're trying to figure out, maybe you start praying. That's what I do when I can't go back to sleep. I want to do something productive, right? But there's an anticipation. Let's get this over with. Let's get the sun up. Let's go ahead and get into this next day rather than sort of waiting for that. And we're kind of in the night right now, in a sense, aren't we? The night before the coming of the dawn as Jesus returns. And we're getting a little, anxious about that return. Come on, Jesus, come on back. Don't you see what's happening, how terrible things are? We need you to come back now. And of course, he is coming back. But in that moment, it's the night. And here's the thing, it's almost gone. There's not much more time. Now, let's connect that back into a couple of things in the chapter. First of all, let's connect it back a little earlier in chapter 12 with the final verse. Do not